Welcome again on behalf of World Monuments Fund and the Getty Conservation Institute and other colleagues who've worked together on the ARCHES system that we're going to be presenting this morning. I'm Bonnie Burnham, the president of the World Monuments Fund. And as many of you know, World Monuments Fund is primarily a field organization, nonprofit organization that works around the world on a site-specific basis to preserve cultural heritage. After the crisis and the war in Iraq in 2003, WMF, like other organizations working in this field internationally, wanted to find a way to make a meaningful contribution to Iraq and try to address some of the catastrophic events that had happened there in the course of the war. And in conversation with my colleague Tim Whalen, of course, we learned that the Getty was also considering what kind of options there were to be of assistance, and we decided that we would work together in a coordinated fashion. Ultimately, the Department of State joined our efforts and supported them, but that initial collaboration between WMF and GCI was the place where the idea of this database system came about. At the time, there was not much access to the ground in Iraq. It was the circumstances were very turbulent. And furthermore, the people who were responsible for cultural heritage in the country were trying to piece together a national structure for heritage management where there had virtually not been anything in place and where people had not been trained in conservation over the years under Saddam Hussein. And so we ultimately decided that the best thing that we could do to help Iraq in that particular moment was to provide training and to provide tools and resources. And we began developing the first version of the database that we'll be presenting today, which was called MEGA, for Middle Eastern Geodatabase for Antiquities. What happened then was that the Jordanians who had been hosting many of our meetings and training sessions with the Iraqis said that they would really like to have an opportunity to use this new database. And some of our colleagues at WMF had a long relationship working with Jordan on the evolution of its own national heritage management system. And so, in fact, Jordan became, and their Mega Jordan database became the first real trial of this system. And what we discovered was that although the Iraqis had to struggle with the idea of implementing something as sophisticated as this tool turned out to be, there was a real demand around the world for an update of a technological platform for which heritage institutions could maintain inventories. The irony is that virtually every country that has a heritage management system, which is virtually every country, has a system that's based on the idea of inventory. But the record keeping is generally out of date, inaccessible, and under-resourced in terms of the personnel who are devoted to it. And so this situation where there was no platform that anyone could acquire and no data system that anyone could buy that would really serve as an adequate tool was the point of foundation for ARCHES. The investment for World Monuments Fund was a little bit unusual in that so much of our work does tend to be on the ground, and we ultimately in Iraq moved toward a site-specific program at Babylon. But we can cite the fact that through our World Monuments Watch, which is our global advocacy program, we encounter many, many sites that are at risk that may or may not survive in their present form. And that to have a resource that would help to record those sites and continue to gather information about them would be an extraordinarily powerful tool. And so perhaps one day even World Monuments Fund will be a user of its own system. But we do see much wider applications. First of all, it's an essential tool in planning, and I think we'll be hearing, I know we'll be hearing a little bit later today from people from the city of Los Angeles who have been one of the first implementers of the ARCHES system. And this is the goal that the state of Jordan has had in inventorying their archaeological sites in order to prevent new development from impacting those sites. And that was really the point of departure also when we began working on the database system for Iraq. Ironically, I guess, again, we thought that the biggest challenge was going to be development and redevelopment of the country, whereas what they needed, in fact, was a much more fundamental resource. But that planning management capability is a very powerful potential for the system. Secondly, inventories of this nature, if they are openly accessible, can help members of the public learn about the importance of places in their own communities, and sometimes things that are hiding in plain sight. And so we look forward to the application of the system in a case like Los Angeles, where it could become a great public education tool. And then finally, inventories prove their value in times of crisis, when there's a need to document and access information about things that have been destroyed, and to the extent possible, put together the information of what those resources were before and what kind of condition they're in today. And we'll be hearing from another organization, the American School for Oriental Studies, about a program that they're conducting in Syria and Iraq in order to monitor the condition of heritage sites. And those are the general benefits that I see of this development. There's been an overwhelming response from institutions around the world that are interested in using it. Unfortunately, many of those institutions don't really have the staff resources to deploy. And so little by little, we're seeing this move into the public domain, and we hope that it will become the standard. We know it can be the standard for the field in the years to come. I'm now going to invite my colleague, Tim Whalen, the director of the Getty Conservation Institute, to make some more remarks about how the Getty became involved in this and their stewardship of the program.
Good morning. Thanks very much, Bonnie. It's great to be here with all of you. I'm Tim Whalen, the director of the Getty Conservation Institute in Los Angeles, and my colleagues and I are delighted to be here with our partners, the World Monuments Fund. For many years now, the World Monuments Fund has been one of our most important and most valuable partners. The project we are speaking about this morning was only possible because of this joint effort and partnership, and I want to thank Bonnie and her colleagues for all they've invested intellectually and financially into this multi-year effort. The Getty Conservation Institute works around the world to advance conservation practice. So our work is different than the WMF's, but it's wholly complementary. In all of our endeavors, we work to create and share knowledge that will benefit and serve professionals that care for the cultural heritage, both movable cultural heritage and immovable cultural heritage. So through scientific research, capacity building, fieldwork, publications, and the creation of new tools, we deliver our mission. The development of ARCHES in partnership with the WMF is yet another example of this. As Bonnie said, this project, ARCHES, has its origins in the early days of the war in Iraq. Think back to April of 2003, when all of us here read in the New York Times one April morning that the Baghdad Museum had been sacked. And it was around that same time that details of the mass looting in Iraq were being made known in the press. In March 2004 in Amman, the WMF and the Getty signed an agreement with the Iraq State Board of Antiquities and Heritage. And over the coming 3 years, we were able to bring together more than 30 archaeologists from across Iraq to meet colleagues from the Middle East, from Europe, and from North America, and to share advancements in the field of cultural heritage conservation, from which they've been cut off for more than a decade. As Bonnie mentioned, MEGA, the Middle East Geodatabase for Antiquities, was created as part of this larger initiative. Together with Farallon Geographics in San Francisco, the World Monuments Fund and the GCI created a geospatial and web-based software platform, bilingual in Arabic and English, to deploy by the Iraq State Board for Antiquities and ultimately Jordan as well, to inventory and manage the archaeological records in those countries. But from MEGA, we learned a great deal about such a system's strengths and its weaknesses, and also about the challenges of implementing those systems in far-flung places. But nonetheless, we were once again reminded of the huge importance that inventories play and the fact that they are the first line of defense in the preservation of cultural heritage, whether that's in New York City or whether that's in lands controlled by ISIL at the moment. While MEGA served and continues to serve an important purpose, it was limited in its abilities beyond the archaeological heritage, and thus the notion of ARCH was born. ARCHES is a new tool that allows for the collection and management of data of the full spectrum of immovable cultural places, including archaeology, architecture, buildings, sites, monuments, districts, and landscapes. ARCHES provides a sophisticated but back to the basics state-of-the-art tool for organizations and individuals to house and manage their inventories of historic resources. ARCHES incorporates widely adopted international standards for heritage inventories and offers a modern platform that can be customized to meet particular heritage, geographic, and political requirements. ARCHES is open source, so it can be freely downloaded by anyone at no cost. The takeaway here is that budget-strapped organizations do not have to pay an annual licensing fee to utilize ARCHES because it resides freely within the public realm. ARCHES incorporates internationally adopted standards for heritage inventories, semantic modeling, and information technology, leading to better practices in the creation and management of heritage data and the facilitation of data exchange and longevity in spite of advances in technology. In other words, it keeps data safe. ARCHES uses the SeeDoc conceptual reference model, an international standard for the exchange of information between cultural heritage institutions. And finally, ARCHES is web-based for the widest possible access. So data that resides within ARCHES can be shared as broadly or as narrowly as its implementer or administrator sees fit. Now, ARCHES has already been adopted by a number of organizations around the world, but this morning you'll hear and learn about two very different examples of how ARCHES has been implemented to the benefit of the cultural heritage. The first example of the deployment of ARCHES this morning is something called Historic PlacesLA, which is now the repository for all of Los Angeles's historic place data. Now, I think this fact may puzzle our New York colleagues that even exists. Nonetheless, HPLA is the largest and most comprehensive implementation of ARCHES to date. And please keep in mind that this very pleasant website you're about to see is really a wolf in sheep's clothing. This is a robust and powerful tool. And when it was implemented in Los Angeles, the press kept talking about what a nice website it was. And indeed, it presents as a nice website. But what's important is the tools and the ability to manipulate it that resides behind what you'll be seeing here. And that's where administrators, agencies, projects have a new tool that they haven't had before. That said, I am now pleased to introduce Janet Hansen, Deputy Manager of the City of Los Angeles's Historic Resources Department in the Department of Planning. Janet will speak about the first very large-scale implementation of ARCHES, which was launched in LA last February. Janet.
Thank you, Tim, and good morning. This is a screenshot of the homepage of Historic Places LA. So I'm honored to be here today to represent Los Angeles and Historic Places LA, the city's historic resources inventory and management system, and as Tim said, the largest customization of ARCHES to date. Historic Places LA is the culmination of Survey LA, the citywide historic resources survey of Los Angeles. This multi-year public-private partnership between the city and the Getty represents the largest and most ambitious survey project to date in the United States and possibly beyond. This is a slide of the ever-interesting shape of the city of Los Angeles, which encompasses almost 500 square miles and includes over 880,000 legal parcels. This is more land area than 8 of the nation's major cities combined. SurveyLA is uncovering thousands of important places, yes, thousands, that represent significant trends in the architectural, social, and cultural history of the city. But the quantity and diversity of the data being collected through SurveyLA posed a significant management challenge for the city. The customization of arches for Los Angeles met that challenge, and now Historic Places LA provides an opportunity to promote arches to a worldwide heritage audience. Although data entry is in process, Historic Places LA already features over 25,000 important cultural resources in Los Angeles, including properties and historic districts identified through SurveyLA and places listed in local, national, and California registers. This is a screenshot of the map view page, and those red clusters and numbers in them represent groupings of historic resources. And as you zoom into those, they spread out till they get to an individual level, and you can then click on them and view the information and have them mapped and see photographs. The system provides search and mapping capabilities and showcases the breadth and diversity of cultural resources in Los Angeles, which includes distinctive residential developments, such as an early Victorian-era streetcar neighborhood near downtown, and the Venice Canals tract of the early 20th century on the city's west side, and a vast range of post-World War II suburbs in the San Fernando Valley. Resource types range from commercial districts in the re-emerging downtown core to monumental bridges and other civic improvements, to folk art as exemplified in the Watts Towers, to auto showrooms and other symbols of the city's love affair with the automobile, and to places that reflect a rich ethnic and cultural diversity. And finally, Los Angeles is home to a world-class collection of modernist architecture, spanning many decades and designed by iconic architects such as Richard Neutra, Rudolf Schindler, and others. This is an image of Neutra Place in the Silver Lake neighborhood of Los Angeles, which is a small district of residences designed by Richard Neutra, and some also collaborating with his son, Dion. Historic resources inventories provide the foundation for preservation planning and are a fundamental tool for any government agency responsible for the management and protection of cultural resources. In the short time since its debut, Historic Places LA has proven to be a vital tool to support planning policies and processes and to generally promote Los Angeles as a place of history. The system allows mapping of development project areas, for example, and then provides detailed information on resources within that area. So the system allows you to draw a shape or a polygon around a project area, and then you would be able to view resources in that area for planning purposes. The system is also being used in innovative ways by the planning department as part of the rewrite of the city's outdated zoning code, which dates back to the 1940s, believe it or not, and to inform development of new community plans. As well, the findings are useful for the entertainment industry in helping location scouts search for and find places that meet specific requirements for filming opportunities. And disaster planning by multiple agencies is facilitated by Historic Places LA, which helps, for example, with planning for earthquake preparedness. Recently, the city began developing a plan to identify soft-story apartment buildings before 1978, and these are affectionately known as dingbat apartments. And this would allow you to search by property type, so you can just type in dingbat, and then it will show you the results of all of those that have been identified. So because they've been surveyed through SurveyLA, findings of those determined significant are readily available and then can aid in decision-making regarding retrofitting efforts. Historic Places LA is now the most advanced cultural resources management inventory system in the United States. As the system demonstrates, ARCHES is applicable to the work of government agencies in the U.S. and around the world charged with protecting heritage places, whether at the local, regional, or national levels. And because ARCHES is open source, government agencies not only save thousands of dollars annually for licensing, but also benefit from the enhancements made by other agencies and other ARCHES applications. So in developing ARCHES, the World Monuments Fund and the Getty have made a groundbreaking contribution to the inventory of management of heritage resources worldwide, and LA is very proud to have been a participant in its development. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Scott Branting, who's the Director of Mapping and Data Integration at the American Schools of Oriental Research, Cultural Heritage Initiatives in Syria and Iraq. Welcome, Scott.
Thank you very much, Bonnie. Thank you to both the World Monuments Fund and the Getty Conservation Institute for hosting us and bringing us here to present to you today. The project that I'm going to be talking about is a little bit different than what you just saw. There are different difficulties that we face in a conflict situation in Syria and Iraq, where perhaps we don't want to let people know where some of the cultural heritage is, but still provide ways that we can monitor and check up on it and try and understand what is happening in a conflict situation. First, a little bit of background in terms of the ASOR Syrian Heritage Initiative. And while the title says Syrian Heritage Initiative, our purview also includes ISIL-controlled portions of Iraq since last October. It has three major goals: to document damage, to promote global awareness of what's happening, and finally to also begin planning emergency and post-war responses to find some way to emerge from the conflict and find ways to preserve cultural heritage in the longer term. There are a wide range, as you can see, of the different activities we have, everything from weekly reports that we put out to understanding sources from social media or other sources in country, working with satellite data, which I'll be showing quite a bit about, as well as building inventories of sites in these locations that we then can monitor through these means. And finally, also then preparing with assessments and on-the-ground information to allow people to hit the ground and running once the conflict ends. It's a partnership, a collaborative partnership then between the American Schools of Oriental Research and the U.S. State Department, and also has received funding from the J.M. Kaplan Fund to do the activities that you'll see. First of all, a few examples here of what it is that we're looking at. This is the site of Nimrod that has been in the news quite recently, located in northern Iraq. This is the Northwest Palace up on the Citadel, and here we can see it in this image from February 26th, prior to much of the damage that has recently been in the news. Using then a variety of different satellite sources, both digital globe as well as skybox imaging, some imagery from Planet Labs, we're able to then task satellites or get existing imagery to take a look and sort of see the developing situation in the conflict. We can move ahead to March 7th. And at this point, we already start to see some damage taking place. Many rumors were also floating around here in the first week of March that ISIL had gone to the site and was doing damage to the site. Things we can point out in this image include they've broken through the wall here into the Northwest Palace, probably with a bulldozer. And then also here there was this white spot that we noticed coming out from the palace, which we thought could be related to the reliefs that were on display within the palace itself under the covered areas of the site. And we could then link this on April 11th with a video that was released by ISIL showing, in fact, this white spot on the ground. Here are the reliefs themselves being carried out by bulldozers, and then attacking them with jackhammers and other mechanisms, sledgehammers and such, to break them up into that white pile that we see. But we can then sort of put together a timeline in which this destruction actually was taking place, and we can see that in the video that they released, portions of this were filmed much earlier than later portions that we'll see. We can then move ahead to the April 17th image from roughly a little over 2 weeks ago, following the explosion at the site. And we can link this up then with the imagery that they showed in the video, the second part of the video, showing the bombs placed alongside the remaining reliefs. and then the explosion and detonation of the palace itself for the destruction of this cultural heritage site. Other examples that we can look at, this is the site of Mari and Deir el-Zor within Syria itself. Here we can look at this important site at the expansion of looting over time. This image from 2011 shows very little looting. But by March of 2014, we already see quite a large expansion here of small looting holes, creating sort of a lunar landscape as groups are then allowed to go to the site to mine it for antiquities. And then a massive expansion that we see with ISIL moving forward with this by November of 2014. We can also look at the infrastructure of this looting, new roadways that are appearing as tracks as people are bringing in heavy machinery, as well as this structure over here with small cell-like rooms right alongside the road that we were concerned may be part of a storage facility to sort and then to put onto to trucks the antiquities to move out of the country. We can also look at more conflict damage directly itself. This location in downtown Aleppo near the citadel of Aleppo. And we can look at it here in 2013, already showing some evidence of damage. But then by 2014, with tunnel bombs having been exploded in the vicinity of the citadel, as well as additional damage from other bombs, we can start to detail out where this damage is occurring and how it is in relationship to the cultural heritage in this location. So far we've been able to put together an inventory of sites, not just individual examples, but on a much broader scale. We've been able to look at 4,414 sites so far to detail damage, and we're finding that 1,107 of these, a little over 25% of the sites are showing evidence of damage due both to the conflict and other activities, and that 73 have been very severely damaged. And many of these severely damaged sites are, of course, the most important sites or the largest sites within Syria that are very well known or that are World Heritage sites. We can then take this data, we can start looking at this and plotting this over time. We can compare this to different areas that were controlled by different groups at different periods. And we can do all this within sort of a geo-referenced system. And that's where ARCHES comes into play. We've been able to upload our sites into the latest version of ARCHES. Here, as with the LA example, you can see the different little circles showing the number of sites that we have in these different locations. And we can then zoom in on an area like the area around the citadel of Aleppo and see all of the different cultural heritage that is available in this location, much like you could see with LA. But then we can compare this to the destruction that's taking place from the conflict itself. In addition, ARCHES provides a very useful platform for us to reach out to different groups that are doing this very similar sorts of work. So work being done by the UN, work being done by a consortium of former excavators within Syria called Syrian, whose geospatial group is out of the University of Durham. We're able to, if we're all on the ARCHES platform, then to share data between each other, to compare different sorts of data, to overlay it on satellite imagery, and to provide then vignettes or aspects of that from different images that we can upload into the ARCHES system to then share more broadly, to bring to bear all the different resources that each of the groups are doing, rather than us each working on our own little silo independently and not understanding what the other groups have and can bring to an understanding of the whole puzzle that we face. In addition, we'll be using it for condition assessments. We'll have a variety of different experts that will be looking through the imagery as well as on-the-ground reports and comparing these, and then using a condition assessment wizard that was built within ARCHES version 3 for them to upload their detailed assessments of what is happening. You can see here the different steps that they can go through with a generalized description and basic condition. They can upload imagery that they might have either from on-the-ground sources or from satellites. They can detail out in a categorized format what the disturbances and threats that are faced by each of the individual cultural heritage sites. and finally some recommendations as to how we can move ahead. We're hoping to then have this not only within our project, but also to expand this to experts working in a variety of parts of the world to be able to get on and get access to the data that we have to be able to pull together these detailed condition assessments and lay the groundwork for eventually emerging from the conflict and finding ways that we can do something to preserve cultural heritage and build back, in some cases, aspects of the cultural heritage that have been lost within both of these countries. So the sort of system that we'll have envisioned, we'll have, for instance, here we have the site of Mari. You'll be able to pull up Mari, pull up a detailed report on it, and we'll be able to share this with the governments of the different countries as we move into the reconstruction phase, and also use this as the basis for experts out in the field to be doing detailed assessments once the conditions allow, and to manage these sites then moving forward for the long term. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Scott. That was terrific. It's my pleasure to introduce Dennis Wuthrich, CEO and founder of Farallon Geographics in San Francisco. Dennis? There it is. Oh, sorry. I'm looking in the back of the room. Dennis and his team are the technical brains behind the code that powers Arches, and we couldn't have had a better partner than Dennis over these years. So thank you, Dennis.
Thank you, Tim. Thanks, Tim. That's quite generous. I really appreciate that. This has been a really great project for us, remarkable in many ways. What I've been asked to do this morning is to give you a little bit of a better sense of how Arches actually works. And you'll be happy to know that I've excised almost every bit of technical jargon from my presentation this morning. But what I wanted to do is focus on two things, which are really incredibly difficult for just about any heritage inventory to do well. And that is to describe heritage inventory in a consistent way, firstly, and then to make it possible to understand the context in which to determine the significance of cultural heritage items. So I want to start with a very simple example. In fact, very simplistic example. So let's look at the problems that go along with describing cultural heritage. Here's a simple example. I've got a hammer here. And if I was to describe this, I'd call it a silver hammer. The problem is, when I use that terminology, it's really unclear what I'm ultimately referring to. Am I referring to the material that it's made of? Or am I referencing the color of the hammer? Or perhaps it's just a name. Or maybe silver represents the period that the artist was working within. So there are a number of ways in which just simple description becomes quite complicated, or at least ambiguous enough to make it difficult to really truly understand what you're describing. Traditionally, what systems have done is they've built software to handle this kind of ambiguity. And unfortunately, in the cultural heritage world, and I think by extension in just about every other discipline, the approach has been to build specific software intended solely for the use of that organization. And it ultimately ends up being a black box in which you put the data. And in fact, really in the world of cultural heritage, it's a whole series of black boxes, none of which really work well with one another. And the fundamental problem here is if you don't actually own the software to understand the data, to display the data, what you have is something like this. This actually is a Microsoft Word document. And if you have Word, the Microsoft Word application, that software is able to take this source file and display it as text that you can read. But in the absence of the application, this is what the actual file looks like. The contents are essentially, they've been encoded in a way that relies on the software. And this is a fundamental problem, and a problem that we set out to make sure that Arches avoided. We did not want to have the same problem in the cultural heritage world with Arches. So back to our hammer, how do we do it in Arches? We take a fundamentally different approach. We start by deciding how we want to organize our inventory. So again, in a very simplistic way, let's say we want to keep an inventory of objects. And those objects might include houses or other structures. They may include bridges or archaeological sites or any of a myriad number of different kinds of physical items. we determine, let's say, that we want to describe our objects based on the components that make up the entirety of the object. So in our case, we might say that our components include a hammer head and a handle. And for any one component, we might be able to describe the materials that make up that component. So this is a very simple way of understanding how Arches works. We take this approach with any kind of cultural heritage. And right off the top, you may see a fundamental problem here, which is, look at the word material. There are a number of ways to really interpret that. One way would be to consider material as a way of describing the fundamental materials that make up a component. But in the world of cultural heritage, one could easily imagine a person interpreting the word material to mean a textile or a cloth. So we have this, already we've introduced some ambiguity into our model. The way Arches deals with this is we define every single term in our data model, and we do it not with an arbitrary ontology, but we use a standard ontology. We actually use the SeeDoc CRM, which Tim mentioned earlier this morning. It's an international standard, and you can think of it as a vocabulary or a way of categorizing cultural heritage information. And here's an example. There is actually an entity in this vocabulary that defines what a material is. And this is a formal definition. So every descriptor in Arches points back to a formally defined concept like this. So now when we attach descriptions to each of our attributes, we know when we use the word silver that we actually mean it to be a material component, not a textile. So that's a very simplistic way of describing how Arches structures its data. And I'll point out that silver itself is a term that really is just happens to be the term we use in English. It's just as valid to be to reference the metal silver in multiple languages with multiple scripts. And Arches acknowledges this and also provides tools to formally define what we mean by the word silver or silver or plata or however you pronounce it in Japanese or in Greek. So these are fundamental tools that are built into Arches, and it allows us to create what we call semantic data. That is to say, the data that Arches creates are self-describing. And that's really important because you don't even need Arches to interpret the data that it creates. Arches creates data that can be shared with whomever the organization chooses to share the data with. And it can be done so in a way in which the knowledge that you impart in how you organize your information is encoded in the data directly. So one of our design goals was to create an application that could build inventories of cultural heritage and still not require itself to read the data. A second really important aspect of this is that not only are the data understandable by people, but by machines. So computers can now infer the data built by Arches, which will allow for reasoning. So you could legitimately ask a computer to answer a question like, where are all the Gothic-style churches located within 500 meters of the River Thames, and also with a fair condition? Those kinds of more natural language processing operations are possible with the kind of data that Arches creates. So this is a key aspect of how we wanted to build our core technology. We wanted to make description of cultural heritage consistent and shareable even if you don't have the application. But I mentioned there's two problems with inventories. One is describing things consistently, and a second is determining the significance of an actual cultural heritage item. And I thought I'd run through a second example to illustrate how Arches deals with this. So really, it boils down to understanding the context in which you're going to make an evaluation of a cultural heritage object. Well, let's look at an example. This is an actual an actual building, an actual house in Los Angeles. And the question is it significant or not? And in the absence of any other information, really all you can do is look at the house as, you can evaluate it based on its architecture or its age. And in the case I just showed you, neither the age nor the architectural elements of the house are in and of themselves particularly significant. On the other hand, we do know a few things about this house. Firstly, it was owned by Johnny Weissmuller, who was an Olympic swimming champion early part of the last century, and made his real name, his fame, from portraying Tarzan in the movies. The house actually turns out to be located just a stone's throw from Tarzana, which is a district in Los Angeles that was incorporated based on the original ranch lands owned by the original author of the Tarzan books. So that's an interesting little tidbit. House turned out to have been designed by an architect named Paul Williams, who was perhaps the most influential African-American architect working in Los Angeles at the early part of the last century. He's famous for designing a number of houses for Hollywood, famous Hollywood folks, but in my mind at least, perhaps more importantly, he was the designer of the 28th Street YMCA, a structure that's already acknowledged as being culturally significant. And he also was the designer of the theme building at the Los Angeles airport, where you saw a photograph of that just a few moments ago. And we can go on and on in this way. Turns out a guy named Mick Jagger lived there for a while. I think he was culturally significant in the 60s. And another owner of the house was an artist named Nicolosi, who provided the original bronze statues that appeared on the Los Angeles Coliseum for hosting the 1932 Olympics. So my point here is any one of these facts in and of themselves might seem trivial, but taken collectively, and as you start to integrate those facts, you can build a case for significance that's much more objective and much less subjective than you could otherwise. So when I say context is everything in understanding the significance of cultural heritage, what I'm really trying to suggest is until you understand the relationship of a cultural heritage object with other objects in the inventory, it's very difficult to understand how significant it is. Now, we know from Facebook that there's such a thing as a social network. The connectivity of people is important. And really what I'm trying to suggest here is that there's a similar idea here that we could start talking about a heritage network, a network of cultural heritage objects that are significant and intertwined in some way. And that's one of the key design goals that we had in mind when we built Arches. Now, there is one significant difference here, and that is that Arches, unlike Facebook, is not a monolithic application. It's actually built to be used on a case-by-case basis. So an individual organization such as the City of Los Angeles or Scott's work in Syria, or really any city or state or national agency tasked with managing cultural heritage could use Arches and then could choose to share their information and create networks of Arches implementations, or they could also choose to stand alone. It's really up to the individual organization to decide how they can best meet their goals for preserving and conserving cultural heritage. I'm going to just finish by showing you a couple screenshots above and beyond what you've seen already. And for those of you who are interested, after the question and answer period, I'd be willing and quite happy to show a more detailed demonstration of Arches, actually looking at how the software works and demonstrating the creation of cultural heritage records. So just let me know if you're interested in staying around for that. A point that I wanted to make was the context in which you start to evaluate cultural heritage objects really isn't just relationships between one structure and another, but between objects and people and events and activities. And so Arches acknowledges this and actually is built to manage different categories of cultural heritage, including individual monuments, groups of cultural heritage objects, people and organizations, historic events and activities, as well as what we call information objects. So things that encode information, like photographs or documents, or even, as I like to point out, 33 1/3 LP records are information encoders. So that's the kind of thing that you could track in Arches as well. Despite all the semantic magic that's going on behind the scenes, the actual data entry process in Arches is really quite simple. And we've tried really hard to make it simple enough for someone to not have to understand how do you build a semantic model, or how do you create a geographic or GIS representation of an object. So the data entry forms, we've tried our best to make really simple and intuitive. They include the ability to just develop information within the Arches interface, or if you already have information, let's say you've been out in the field and you have a GPS file that shows you where your data are, you can just drag and drop that into Arches to create a record. And for more complex kinds of descriptions, Arches introduces an idea that we call a wizard, so a data entry form, which is in a sense a wizard that steps you through the specific steps to create a complete record. And then probably the most key thing is within Arches is what we call a reference data manager. This is where you define the terminology that you want to use for describing your cultural heritage in a way that conforms to international standards. So what you're looking at here is an example of a thesaurus entry in Arches where we can define what we mean by the label gold. We can define it in multiple languages, and we can actually give it a real definition and insert it into a concept hierarchy. So Arches comes with the tools that you need to build your data and information models correctly and accurately. And with that, thank you very much for your attention.
And that concludes our speaking program for today, but we want to open it up for any questions you may have for any of the speakers.
So the question was, does Arches allow for crowdsourcing? And the answer is only about halfway. So right now, what Arches does is it allows you to define the access privileges that you wish to grant to different people. So you can decide to give a person complete access and the ability to create a complete record or just a partial record. So I guess you could argue that perhaps you could use it for crowdsourcing. Personally, I would say that it isn't quite there yet. What you'd really like to do is allow for people to share and upload information in a little holding area, and then you could review that, and based on your review, you could push that into Arches. So that's on that particular pattern is on our radar, our ongoing development plan for Arches.
Curated, absolutely.
Exactly. Great term. Other questions?
I have one question. How often do you see a release, enhancements, new releases for Arches? Is it annual or depending on major breakthroughs?
Right, good. So the question was, how frequently do we plan on releasing upgrades or extensions or ongoing versions of Arches? What kind of schedule are we on? And I'd say probably the most direct way to answer that question is to say that we're planning on doing ongoing maintenance fixes in the very near term, so on a monthly or bi-monthly basis, say. And then large additions to functionality will be driven essentially based on user demand. So what we're really expecting is that either someone in the open source community will contribute a new chunk of functionality to Arches, and that'll extend to everyone, or we may be approached at Farallon to create additional software functionality. And that's likely to be, I expect that to happen, and I would say it would be realistic to look at, maybe every 6 months to 8 months of of additional functionality released. Question?
I wonder if there's a way to link to movable resources like archaeological collections that are associated with sites that are.
Yeah, so that's a great question. A question was about linking or tracking movable assets, and Arches actually is built to do that. I sort of glossed over this, but when I mentioned that right now this first release of Arches actually includes a very specific application to manage immovable heritage, and it conceptualizes individual heritage resources, groups of resources, and then people and organizations, activities, all that sort of thing. Really, for a collection, what you'd probably need to do is introduce an additional typology, additional category of information to track, like an actual collection object. They actually have a somewhat unique data requirements, and so this is a long way of getting to the point, which is to do that in Arches, we'd have to create one more data model and put that into Arches. So that would represent a minimal amount of work to do that properly. Other questions? There are other speakers, by the way. Question?
Have you done a project that has been principally done in Arabic yet?
The Mega Jordan project was done principally in Arabic. In fact, if you look at the Kingdom of Jordan is continuing, that is the system of record for the Kingdom of Jordan, and they're using that system on a daily basis. And most of the records, in fact, I just checked the other morning, most of the records are coming in primarily as Arabic first. What you'll notice is there are certain records that are selections you can pick from a drop-down list. Those you can toggle between English and Arabic. And in Arches, you can toggle between really any languages you want. The actual information that you type in a free text sort of way, so like a description, is up to the person to decide how they want to enter that. And in Jordan, it is Arabic first. Additional questions, anyone? Okay, thank you.
Thank you again for joining us, and if you would like to be part of this deeper session, please identify yourselves to the representative from Farallon. I'm sure we'll be happy to work with you. Thank you for coming.